The value of dry January isn't whether you drink again in February. It's what becomes obvious when alcohol isn't in the picture. Most people go into the month thinking the hard part is not drinking. But for a lot of people, that's actually not the hardest part at all. The harder part is sitting with what shows up when alcohol isn't doing its usual job.
You've tried to quit before. Maybe it worked for a while. Maybe it didn't. But deep down, you know sobriety isn't just about not drinking. It's about finding peace, purpose, and finding yourself again. Welcome to the Sober and Happy Podcast. Each week, Tim shares hard-earned lessons from his own decade of recovery, real talk, real methods, and the mindset that helped him turn the fight of sobriety into a life he actually loves. This is the Sober and Happy Podcast. Now, here's your host, Tim Phillips.
Welcome back to the Sober and Happy Podcast. Since it's the beginning of the year, there's a good chance a lot of you are either thinking about doing dry January, you're already in the middle of it, or you've done it before and you decided to give it another shot this year. So I want to start with something that might feel a little different than what you usually hear around this topic. Most people don't struggle with dry January because they can't stop drinking for 31 days. A lot of people could do that, at least on paper. Where people tend to struggle is how they think about the month while they're in it. For a lot of folks, dry January turns into something that you just try to get through. You're counting down the days, reminding yourself it's temporary, and maybe even already thinking about what February's going to look like once it's finally over. And when that's the mindset, the month doesn't really give you much back. You might make it to the end, but you don't walk away with much clarity. You don't really learn anything about yourself or about the role alcohol plays in your life. So today I want to talk about a different way to approach dry January. Not as a challenge, not as a detox, and not as something you just endure until the calendar flips. I want to talk about using this month as a simple, honest experiment that could give you some useful information about your relationship with alcohol, especially if you're someone who's been feeling curious about sobriety, but not sure what that really means to you. So if we're going to think about dry January as an experiment instead of something you just power through, it helps to look at how that old mindset actually shows up in real life, because it's usually not loud or dramatic. It usually shows up in small, almost automatic ways that feel normal when you're in them. I've talked to a lot of people who do dry January, and one of the first things they'll say is how they often catch themselves thinking about when it's over. They'll say things like, I'm just trying to make it to the end. Or once February hits, things will finally go back to normal. Sometimes they even joke about it. They'll talk about the drink they're going to have on February 1st, or a weekend they already have planned, and they don't really realize what they're saying in that moment. Because without meaning to, they've already decided that nothing about this month is supposed to stick. The whole point becomes getting through January so you could return to what feels familiar. And I understand why that mindset shows up. A month feels manageable. It feels safe. There's comfort in having an end date. You're not saying that you'll never drink again. You're just saying, not right now. And that can take a lot of pressure off. But when you go into it that way, dry January turns into a countdown instead of a check-in. You're so focused on when you're allowed to drink again that you don't spend much time noticing what's actually changing while you're not drinking. And that's the part most people miss. The evenings, the stress, the boredom, the moments when you realize what alcohol is actually doing for you or covering up once it's not there anymore. So when you notice all of that, the counting down, the planning ahead, the focus on when you're allowed to drink again, that's the moment where dry January could either become kind of useless or incredibly helpful. Because here's the shift. The value of dry January isn't whether you drink again in February. It's what becomes obvious when alcohol isn't in the picture. Most people go into the month thinking the hard part is not drinking. But for a lot of people, that's actually not the hardest part at all. The harder part is sitting with what shows up when alcohol isn't doing its usual job. And alcohol usually does have a job. For some people, it takes the edge off stress at the end of the day. For others, it fills boredom. For many, it helps them shut their brain off. For some, it's how they relax or how they feel comfortable around other people. And for a lot of people, myself included, it's often doing all of those things at the same time. So when you remove alcohol for a month, those needs don't disappear, they just surface. That's why some people feel restless in the evenings during dry January, or irritated, or kind of flat, or like something is missing even if they can't quite put their finger on it. That feeling isn't a sign that dry January isn't working. It's a sign that it is. Because now you're seeing the role alcohol was playing instead of just the habit of drinking itself. That's where the mindset matters. If you're treating dry January like a test of discipline, all of that discomfort feels like something you need to push through. You grit your teeth, distract yourself, and tell yourself it'll all be over soon. But if you treat it like an experiment, that discomfort becomes information. Instead of asking, how do I make this feeling go away? You start asking, what is this feeling trying to tell me? Why does this time of day feel harder? Why does stress feel louder without a drink? Why does boredom feel so uncomfortable right now? Why do social situations feel different? Those questions aren't problems to solve in January, but they are clues. And this is the part a lot of people miss. You don't have to answer all of those questions this month. You just have to notice them. You're collecting data, not making lifelong decisions. Dry January works best when you stop trying to prove something and start paying attention instead. You're not trying to prove that you don't have a problem. You're not trying to prove that you do have one. You're not trying to decide the rest of your life. You're just asking, what does my life actually look like without alcohol in it? And for people who are sober curious, that question is way more useful than any rule or label. So if dry January isn't about pushing through discomfort and it's not about proving anything to anyone, then the obvious question becomes, what are you actually supposed to do with this month while you're in it? And the answer isn't more rules. It's paying attention, but in a specific way. Most people either ignore what they're feeling or they judge it. They tell themselves they shouldn't feel bored or irritated or restless because they're doing something healthy. But those reactions just shut the whole process down. A better approach is to slow things down and notice patterns instead of moments. For example, instead of thinking today was hard, it's more useful to notice when it was hard. Was it the same time every evening? Was it after work? Was it when you were alone? Was it when you were stressed, bored, or tired? The same thing goes for easier moments too. If something felt better than you expected, whether it's sleeping, mornings, focus, conversations, that matters just as much. A lot of people overlook that part and only focus on the struggle. You're not trying to fix any of this in January. You're just observing it honestly. It can help to ask yourself a few simple questions as the month goes on. Not all at once, just whenever they naturally come up. For example, what am I hoping alcohol would help with right now? What am I actually needing in this moment instead? What surprised me about today without drinking? What feels different than I thought it would? You don't need to write a novel about it. Just a few notes in your phone will do. This goal isn't perfection. It's awareness. Because the more clearly you see what alcohol is doing in your life, the less confusing your next decision becomes. Whatever that decision ends up being. So once you start paying attention in that way, noticing patterns instead of judging moments, something interesting usually happens. The pressure to figure out what comes next starts to ease up a little because you don't actually need to decide anything right now. One of the biggest mistakes people make with dry January is feeling like they need to have the answer by the end of the month. Am I drinking again? Am I quitting forever? Am I cutting back? What's the rule going forward? But clarity doesn't come from forcing a decision. It comes from seeing things clearly first. And that's really the opportunity this month gives you. Not to label yourself, not to make promises you're not ready to keep, but to pause long enough to understand what alcohol has been doing in your life and what life feels like without it in the picture. So here's what I want to leave you with this week. Instead of asking yourself what you're going to do in February, ask yourself one simpler question first. What have I learned about myself during this month that I didn't see before? That's it. No action required, just honesty. And for this week's challenge, I want you to write down, or at least clearly think through, one thing that's been harder than you expected during dry January, and one thing that's been easier or better than you thought it would be. Not to judge either one, just to notice them. Because whatever you decide to do this month, that information matters. And using it intentionally is what separates another temporary break from real growth. Thank you for listening. If this episode resonated with you, send it to one person you think might be experimenting with sobriety right now or quietly questioning their relationship with alcohol. You never know how helpful this nudge might be. New episodes come out each week, and I'll see you next time. And as always, keep living sober and happy.
Thanks for listening to the Sober and Happy podcast with Tim Phillips. If today's episode connected with you, share it with someone who needs it. You can follow Tim on social at I Am Sober and Happy and visit soberandhappy.com for tools, motivation, and more episodes. Remember, quitting drinking is just the beginning. The real goal is learning to love yourself and love your life. This has been the Sober and Happy podcast. See you next time.